Hello everybody! This is 3 months too late, and today I would like to share with you all my theory on Nightcrawler is the Winding Way. I first came up with this theory back in June of 2022, where I posted about it on Reddit. Links to those posts in the description below in case you want to read them for yourselves. But with all that out of the way, let's dive into the video. So I think most people have some familiarity with the X-Men character of Nightcrawler. But in case if anybody needs a bit of a refresher, his name is Kurt Wagner. He was first introduced to the X-Men back in Giant Size X-Men #1 alongside characters like Storm and Colossus. He's been a member of the X-Men for a long time, but has also served with the X-Men's British team, Excalibur, which he led for quite a while. He is also a former circus performer and priest. He almost became the Pope at one point, and is now serving as one of the Quiet Council members of Krakoa. Anyways, more pertinent to this discussion, he is secretly the victim of a heinous crime which even he is not aware of. What am I talking about? Well, let's start with something small. Back in the third Nightcrawler solo series from 2006, there was a story called Nightcrawler the Winding Way. The basic gist of this story is that Nightcrawler suddenly becomes the target for a number of mystical attacks, and Kurt has to figure out why this is happening. The story itself really isn't all that eventful, but the revelation that comes out of it actually is important. See, Nightcrawler's love interest and, at the time, ruler over Limbo, Amanda Sefton, had decided to fuse the Soul Sword with him, which is what was causing Kurt to be attacked by all those magical threats. Why did Amanda decide to fuse the Soul Sword with Nightcrawler? Well, Amanda claimed that she did this to protect the Soul Sword from falling into the wrong hands while she was magically weak. Now, on the face of it, this seems like a perfectly valid justification for fusing the Soul Sword with Nightcrawler. The problem is, once you start digging, that justification falls apart very quickly. Especially seeing as Amanda has a bit of a history of being a liar. Predominantly, she lied to Kurt about her identity when they first started dating. Her real name is actually Szardos. On top of that, in this very story, Kurt has to call out Amanda on her inability to give him a straight answer, and it should not go over our heads that she failed to tell Kurt that she had fused the Soul Sword with him until her mother had outed her. So this naturally raises the question, is Amanda telling the truth? Well, it should be noted that shortly after Amanda fused the Soul Sword with Nightcrawler, she lost control over Limbo to Belasco. Now, maybe this is a situation where Belasco is just naturally more powerful than Amanda is. After all, any time that Amanda has fought him in the past, she's had help. However, considering the timing of this attack, if Belasco could take Amanda in a fight, then why didn't he try to invade before? Well, most likely this was because Amanda had the Soul Sword, a weapon which Belasco has been established to be vulnerable to. But hang on a minute. If Amanda needs the Soul Sword to rule over Limbo, if it's the thing that's keeping her in power, then why get rid of it? And really, when you think about it, out of all the potential candidates to protect the Soul Sword, Kurt is probably one of the worst options. Primarily because he's not a trained sorcerer. He has no means by which to defend himself against the magical threats that would be attracted by the Soul Sword. And even beyond this, Amanda didn't provide Kurt with any sort of magical protection to keep the Soul Sword safe, and she didn't even tell Kurt that she had done this. In short, if the safety of the Soul Sword was the objective here, it would have made more sense for Amanda to hold on to it. But even beyond all of this, her actions in the Winding Way story directly contradict Amanda's previous actions in Excalibur #85. In that issue, Amanda ended up taking the Soul Sword away from Kitty Pryde after Kitty became the target for a number of magical attacks, similar to Nightcrawler during the Winding Way story. And Amanda explicitly cites that the reason she was taking the Soul Sword away from Kitty was because Kitty was not a trained sorceress and could not protect the Soul Sword from said threats, and that she would only be endangering herself by holding on to them. This all naturally raises the question why Kurt would be considered an appropriate guardian of the Soul Sword when Kitty is not. Not to mention, this still doesn't explain why Amanda got rid of the Soul Sword. Well, as it turns out, Amanda has more claims about why she got rid of the Soul Sword and why she fused it with Kurt specifically. According to Amanda, the reason she got rid of the Soul Sword was because she was afraid that the Soul Sword would be able to corrupt her. However, she thought that Kurt's pure soul would be able to resist the same corruption. So, a few problems with Amanda's claims here. And by a few, I mean, wow. I'll give Amanda some credit here. To the unobservant eye, there does seem to be some evidence that the soul sword might be corruptive. However, like Amanda's other claims so far, the moment that you hold them up to any amount of scrutiny, they crumble. Let's go through these one by one. So it is true that Ilyana Rasputin, the soul sword's creator and original wielder, did suffer from demonic corruption. However, there is no evidence to suggest the soul sword was the source of that corruption. In fact, back during Ex Infernus, when Darkchild, Ilyana's demonic half, touched the soul sword, she reverted back to Ilyana. Additionally, there was an instance where Kitty Pryde did become temporarily corrupted by the soul sword back during Excalibur after the soul sword fused with her. However, the comic actually explains that the only reason this happened was because Kitty was not a trained sorceress and was not used to the magical energies that the soul sword gave off. Things that would obviously not apply to Amanda Sefton, a trained sorceress. Interestingly, Nightcrawler never had an instance of this taking place when Amanda fused the soul sword with him. Continuing on to the next wielder of the soul sword, Margali Szardos did go on a killing spree, murdering several other members of the Winding Way to obtain their power for herself. However, Margali has done similarly heinous things both before and after obtaining the soul sword. So it's not likely this was the soul sword's doing, and this was just Margali being herself. Additionally, one of the magical threats who attempted to steal the soul sword from Kitty was a sorcerer named Gravemoss, who was another member of the Winding Way that was planning on using the soul sword in the exact same way that Margali ultimately did. This shows that the idea of using the soul sword to kill other members of the Winding Way and obtaining their power was not exclusive to Margali. The final potential instance that one might point to as evidence of the soul sword being corruptive is with Amanda herself. Back during the X-Men Black Sun event, Amanda took up Ilyana's identity and began to masquerade as her. However, a big part of this comic was establishing that this was in fact Amanda who was just using Ilyana's identity as a means to fool her enemies, quote unquote. So yeah, outside of one instance of the soul sword overwhelming an inexperienced Kitty Pryde, which is a circumstance that wouldn't even apply to Amanda, there's not really any evidence to suggest that the soul sword is actually corruptive. Which means that Amanda's reasoning for getting rid of the soul sword is absolute bogus. The more glaring issue with Amanda's claims is that Kurt is not immune to magical corruption. Back during the original Magic series, Belasco was able to corrupt Nightcrawler into being his mindless slave, and then later, during the Secret Wars Inferno story, Magic was able to corrupt Kurt into being a demon by ripping out his soul. Now yes, both of these are alternate universe Nightcrawlers, but particularly the OG Magic series Nightcrawler was simply a version of Nightcrawler that followed Ilyana into Limbo to rescue her. Apart from that, there is no difference between him and mainstream Nightcrawler, which means that 616 Nightcrawler should be every bit as susceptible to magical corruption as that version was. So I think at this point it's pretty obvious that Amanda has lied her way into a corner here. Because either the soul sword is not corruptive and she's been lying to Kurt about why she fused it with him, in which case, why did she get rid of it, especially seeing as it was so critical for her keeping control over Limbo? Or she is telling the truth about the soul sword and that it is corruptive, in which case, why fuse it with Nightcrawler? Why even take that risk and put his life in danger when there were other options? Because there were other options. Amanda could have taken the soul sword to Doctor Strange and he alone would have had multiple ways of dealing with the situation. Additionally, Kitty Pryde, back in Excalibur, back when she first obtained the soul sword, she ended up phasing the soul sword into a magical rock that not even the Phoenix could remove it from. And if Kitty Pryde can come up with something like this, then why can't Amanda? And why even fuse the soul sword with Nightcrawler? What does that even accomplish? It doesn't protect the soul sword. Both Margali Szardos and Pixie were able to remove the soul sword, quite easily at two separate points in time. At this point, all that fusing the soul sword with Kurt accomplishes is just endangering Kurt. It puts a magical target on his back that he has to carry with him wherever he goes. one which he is ill-equipped to defend against. Unless that's the point. Now let's remember here, Amanda was the one who fused the soul sword with Nightcrawler, knowing full well that Kurt has no means by which to defend against the magical threats. She would know full well the sort of magical threats that the soul sword would attract, having been the one who originally took the soul sword away from Kitty Pryde. Not to mention the time period which she possessed the soul sword herself. And then, despite knowing all of this, she fails to provide any sort of magical protection to Kurt to ensure the soul sword's safety. And on top of all of that, she didn't even tell Kurt what she had done until her mother had outed her and forced her to come clean. When you stack up all the facts, it really looks like Amanda was never interested in trying to protect the soul sword, and that the actual objective was trying to get Kurt attacked for some reason. But why? Why would Amanda want Kurt, the man she loves, to be attacked? Well, let's think about what the soul sword is and why exactly Amanda may have been trying to fuse it with Nightcrawler, and see if that might help explain the situation. So what is the soul sword? Well, the soul sword is a magical weapon first created by Ilyana Rasputin and made from a fragment of Ilyana's soul or life force, depending on the comic. She originally did this to fight the demons in Limbo while she was trapped there as a child. Along with being able to kill demons, the soul sword can be used in a number of ways, including as a magical power source and as a means to break other spells. With all that in mind, let's think about what Amanda did by fusing the soul sword with Kurt. According to the Winding Way comic, Amanda fused it with him by integrating the soul sword throughout his very being, to quote Amanda directly. The soul sword is a fragment of Ilyana's soul, so when Amanda fused it with Nightcrawler, she was actually fusing Kurt and Ilyana's souls together. And this is all interesting considering what happens next. You see, during Ex Infernus, Pixie ends up ripping the soul sword out of Nightcrawler. Now I should note, Pixie was corrupted at this point and was still learning magic. This whole event actually began during the middle of one of Pixie's magic lessons. And what this means is that Pixie very likely wasn't trying to separate the soul sword cleanly from Kurt. And because the soul sword was integrated throughout his whole being, it's very likely that a piece of Kurt's soul was torn out with the soul sword when Pixie removed it. And this was all very likely Amanda's intention. Again, Amanda was the one who fused the soul sword with Kurt, knowing that it would attract magical threats to him which he couldn't defend against. And any magical threat that would have been trying to retrieve the soul sword would have had to remove it like how Pixie did. Meaning that depending on how well Amanda integrated the blade with Kurt, the same result would have happened regardless. What's more, Margali, Amanda's mother, has more or less confirmed this part to be true. In Legion of X number 10, she tells Kurt that the soul sword, when the soul sword was removed from him, it left gaps. And all of this may help explain something curious about the soul sword. You see, following magic recovering it, Ilyana realized that the soul sword had gained a new trait that it did not previously possess. It could now damage Technarchy. Something had changed with the soul sword from the last time that she had possessed it. And perhaps more dramatically, following the events of Avengers vs. X-Men, the soul sword's appearance changed from being a fairly standard glowing magic sword to a very unique black and white stained glass greatsword. And the timing of this change should be noted as well. You see, after their possession by the Phoenix Force, all of the Phoenix Five were suffering from a loss of control over their powers, including Ilyana. This likely means that the cause of this change in appearance would not be from Ilyana herself, but from another source. And if a portion of Nightcrawler's soul was fused with the soul sword, then it would not be too big of a leap in logic for that soul fragment to be the cause of this change in appearance. Getting back on topic, all of this begs the question of why Amanda was trying to put a piece of Nightcrawler's soul into the soul sword. Well, to answer this, let's take another look at Amanda's history with the soul sword and see if we can dig something up. Back in Excalibur number 85, Amanda obtained the soul sword from Kitty Pryde after Kitty was attacked by various different magical entities. Amanda then handed the soul sword off to Margali, her mother, who in turn used it to kill other members of the Winding Way and steal their power for herself. After a failed attempt to obtain a magical power from a demon living under London, endangering the entire city in the process, Margali wound up in limbo, where she ended up captured by Belasco, who took the soul sword from her. Then, in a desperate attempt to save herself and whatever power she had left, Margali swapped her mind with Amanda's, effectively leaving her daughter for dead in limbo. Following this, in X-Men Unlimited number 19, Nightcrawler learned the truth about what Margali had done and convinced her to go back to limbo with him to rescue Amanda, which they ended up accomplishing, defeating Belasco. And for some reason, Amanda then decided to take over limbo and become its next ruler. After this, she doesn't show up again until X-Men Black Sun, where it's revealed that Amanda had taken up possession of the Soul Sword as well as Illyana's identity, which she claimed she was using to fool her enemies. From here, it's pretty much all the stuff that we have covered so far, from Amanda fusing the Soul Sword with Kurt during the third Nightcrawler solo series, to Pixie removing the Soul Sword from him during X Infernus. Okay, so there are three major points that stick out to me on this timeline that seem to correlate with each other a bit too well. Firstly, Amanda only becomes involved with the Soul Sword in the first place because her mother wanted to use it to obtain power in the Winding Way. The second point of interest is that Amanda decided to take over Limbo seemingly for no reason. And let's not undersell this here. Why did Amanda actually take over Limbo? Because her claims on the matter don't make any sense. Firstly, she claims that she did so to keep Limbo from ever threatening Earth, which doesn't really make any sense. Limbo wasn't threatening Earth at that point. It was Margali and Amanda who ended up in Limbo. And if keeping Limbo from attacking Earth was the reason for her taking over, then why get rid of the Soul Sword? The one thing that every demon in Limbo fears and would be the one thing that keeps them in check. Amanda also claims that she took over Limbo because she was the only one eligible to rule after Belasco and Margali left, but that completely ignores the reason why Amanda would want to rule Limbo at all. Because Amanda doesn't have any reason to want to rule over Limbo. She had just spent several days, weeks, months, an inordinate amount of time being tortured there after her mother had left her to die. Amanda shouldn't want to have anything to do with the place, and yet she takes over. And this all takes place after her mother attempted at taking power in the Winding Way using the Soul Sword. Not to mention, this is the first opportunity that Amanda has to obtain the Soul Sword, after that event, because the Soul Sword is in Limbo at this time. And when you consider that the next time we see Amanda, she has taken up the identity of Illyana Rasputin, the Soul Sword's original creator and host, it suddenly becomes very suspicious when paired with the previous point. Additionally, it should not be lost on us that Limbo is the realm where the Soul Sword was created. If Amanda wanted to learn more about the Soul Sword, taking over Limbo would be a very good way of doing so. But hang on a minute. Let's double back to the timeline here for a second. There's something weird. So Amanda only became interested in the Soul Sword because it could influence the Winding Way. And then she decides to use the Soul Sword and fuse it with Nightcrawler. This means that there's some sort of a connection between the Winding Way, the Soul Sword, and Nightcrawler. But again, Amanda only became interested in the Soul Sword after it was proven by her Margali to be able to influence the Winding Way. Meaning that this connection is actually between the Winding Way and Nightcrawler. Was Amanda trying to give Nightcrawler some sort of power in the Winding Way? Is that her goal here? But why? What would she be trying to do that for? Which brings up the next question, what is the Winding Way? Well, according to Margali Szardos and Amanda Sefton, the Winding Way is a magical road or portal that meanders through the outer realms of Marvel Comics, and acts like a power source for those who knows how to tap into it. Perhaps most famously, the Winding Way is known for its cyclical fluctuations in power. Members of the Winding Way can go from being all-powerful mages who can will entire dimensions into being one moment, to being powerless humans who can't even read their tea leaves the next. Now, up until this point in the presentation, we've emphasized just how treacherous Margali Szardos can be, as well as how much of a liar Amanda Sefton is. Can we really trust the word of these two women when it comes to the Winding Way? Thankfully, there's a much more trustworthy source that we can rely on for our information on the Winding Way. In Legion of X number 9, a data page from the archives of the Sorceress Supreme was released going over the basic parts of what exactly the Winding Way is and how it works. For the most part, Doctor Strange confirms everything that has been previously established about the Winding Way while also clarifying a few more things. Firstly, the Winding Way is exocentric in nature. That is to say that the Winding Way practitioners derive their power from an outside force. Additionally, Doctor Strange notes that this power source has not been identified and has to wonder whether the Winding Way is a literal road as described by the various practitioners or something a bit more metaphorical. On top of that, the page explains that the Winding Way practitioners go through cycles of powerlessness as a quote-unquote cost for the benefit of their magic. Now, I want to draw attention to that fourth point, talking about the fluctuations in power among the Winding Way users. I note it's interesting that Doctor Strange refers to these periods of powerlessness as a cost, because as far as I've been able to find, there isn't a single other kind of exocentric magic that works like this in the whole of Marvel Comics. Typically, whenever a sorcerer utilizes magic from another source, it is typically in exchange for some sort of favor that said entity demands the user meet. If a sorcerer loses magical power in an exocentric magic system, it's because they have failed to uphold their end of the bargain, and the entity is removing their power for it. A good example of this is with Doctor Strange in a story called The War of the Seven Spheres. Basically, in this story, Doctor Strange is approached by the Vishanti, his primary magical sources for all of his magical powers, who all demand that he partake in a magical war on their behalf. Not wanting to leave Earth unguarded for that period of time, Doctor Strange refuses, and as a result, the vast majority of his power was stripped away from him. All of this is to say that when a sorcerer loses magical power in an exocentric system, it's typically because it's a punishment by whatever entity they are deriving the power from. So I'm rather suspicious that Doctor Strange refers to the sorcerer's loss of power as a cost, especially after stating that the source of the Winding Way is unknown. So what makes the Winding Way so different? Why isn't it like other more typical exocentric magic systems? Well, there could be a few possibilities for this. Maybe the magical entity that powers the Winding Way is particularly fickle, or maybe Margali and Amanda are telling the truth about it and its powers are variable by nature. Unfortunately, I don't think either of these are the case. Why? Because of Margali Szardos. So who is Margali Szardos? We've mentioned her a few times up to this point, but maybe now is a good point to really nail down who she is as a character. Now, there isn't much known about Margali's early life. Supposedly, she's French and learned magic from her mother. She also probably has some sort of a relation to Sergeant Szardos, the Sorcerer Supreme of the Second World War, though there isn't anything confirmed there. Apart from this, we know that she's the biological mother of Jemaine Szardos, also known as Amanda Sefton, and her older brother, Stefan. She is also the adopted mother of Nightcrawler. Outside of her family, she does have some ties to magical figures, namely Azazel, who she's a former lover of, and Belasco, who seems to be enemies with her for some reason. Beyond this, she is, or rather was, the Sorceress Supreme of the Winding Way, as in its most powerful member. And as we've already covered in this presentation, she is utterly obsessed with obtaining magical power for herself, even at the cost of others. This is probably best shown when she attempted to steal the power of a demon under London for herself, endangering the entire city in the process. Now, it's this instance of Margali's attempting to obtain power that catches my attention, because although Margali fails to do so in this instance, it shows she does have a certain degree of familiarity with trying to steal power from other magical entities. And it all begs the question whether she's attempted to do something like this before. And when taking into account all the crimes that Margali has committed over the years, it becomes really hard to argue that Margali wouldn't do something like this. Firstly, she ended up killing Kurt and Amanda's trapeze trainer back during Excalibur -1, and then pinned the murder on Belasco. And she did this all to convince Amanda to take up the mystic arts in the first place. Later, she manipulated her daughter into giving her the Soul Sword, and then used it to kill several other members of the Winding Way to obtain power for herself back in Excalibur number 85. A few issues later, she tried to steal the power of a demon living under London, which endangered the entire city, and then when that blew up in her face, she ended up mind-swapping with Amanda to save herself from being captured by Belasco. In more recent times, she's tried to access the world beyond, which endangered the entire world, and ultimately resulted in Amanda's death. which all happened during the 4th Nightcrawler solo series. And then most recently, she was commissioned by Orcus to make a hex that turned mutants into monsters, primarily targeting her own son, Nightcrawler, all in Legion of X number 7 through 10. So yeah, I'd say that there's about no line that Margali Szardos would not cross in the name of gaining power for herself. And this might help explain some of the weird inconsistencies about the Winding Way and why its power fluctuates. If the power source of the Winding Way was a separate magical entity that is somehow being forced to basically provide the magical energies for the Winding Way, then it would actually make sense why the power is constantly fluctuating back and forth. Because as the sorcerers of the Winding Way are deriving power from the Winding Way, the magical entity would be trying to basically keep that power for itself. And what that means is that, basically it falls into kind of this weird cycle where, a sorcerer would try to draw power from the Winding Way would then fight back, and then either the Winding Way would win out and strip them of their powers, or the sorcerer would win out and have a bunch of magical power for a while. And this would help explain why the Winding is the way that it is. It is like other forms of exocentric magic. The only difference is that the Winding Way is enslaved and forced to do the bidding of its practitioners, which just flips the normal dynamic of the exocentric magic on its head. And with this in mind, a lot of things start to make a lot more sense. The Winding Way has been described as a portal before, similar to Nightcrawler's teleportation ability. The Winding Way itself is of unknown origin and is likely enslaved to its practitioners, namely Margali Szardos and Amanda Sefton, Nightcrawler's foster family. Margali Szardos also has a history of trying to obtain magical power at the cost of others, including innocent lives and even her own children. And perhaps most glaringly, Amanda Sefton fused the Soul Sword with Nightcrawler after learning that the Soul Sword can influence the Winding Way. Is the reason that Amanda is trying to fuse the Winding Way with the Nightcrawler because the Nightcrawler and the Winding Way are one and the same? Is Nightcrawler actually the Winding Way? Now I know what you're going to be saying here. 3 months, how is that possible? Nightcrawler has never demonstrated having any sort of magical powers before, and it's not like he would naturally have those sort of powers to him, right? He's just a mutant. Well, there is actually one source where he might have gotten magical power from, and that's through his father, Azazel. Now, again, I know what you guys are going to be saying. 3 months, isn't Azazel just a mutant? Well, the truth behind that is a little bit more complicated. Yes, Azazel was established to be a mutant back when he debuted in X-Men number 433 under Chuck Austin. However, since then, there have been multiple different times when someone has referred to Azazel as a demon, to varying levels of legitimacy. One example of this is back during Ex Infernus, where Nightcrawler referred to Azazel as a demon, more or less in passing when talking to Magic. Later on, Azazel refers to himself as a demon when he was waging war against Heaven, which again is kind of a weird thing for someone who's supposedly just a mutant to be doing. And then finally, the demon Naastir actually considers Azazel a demon back during Secret Wars Inferno back in 2015. So there have been several different instances where Azazel has been referred to as a demon. And it really shouldn't be lost on us that it could be both. He could be both a demon and a mutant at the same time, like with Ilyana Rasputin, who is also both a demon and a mutant at the same time. Whatever the truth of the matter is, Azazel definitely has magical power. Whether it be him making Faustian deals with humans on Earth to collect their souls, something which mutants typically cannot do, or being able to disguise himself as a human, which, regardless of whether it's an illusion or shapeshifting, shouldn't have anything to do with his mutant power of teleportation, or his ability to send others to hell without killing them, as seen in Weapon X number 25, it's very clear that Azazel is able to do things that are outside of his official power set of teleportation, as his mutant power has defined it. In fact, mastery over black magic is one of his official powers, and he did train Margali Szardos in the dark arts for a period of time. which is how the two of them first met. And it shouldn't be lost on us either that Azazel is the ruler of his own dimension. And knowing the politics of the various different hell dimensions, knowing that just how cutthroat they are, and how much of a dog-eat-dog situation that is, the idea that Azazel would be able to hold his power for as long as he has, because as far as we're aware, there has never been anybody who has ever managed to oppose or overthrow him during the thousands of years that he's been in charge, which theoretically puts him on the same scale as someone like Mephisto, Dormammu, or Hela. Now, whether or not that theoretical is applicable in practice, that is a completely different thing. Okay, but just because Azazel has magical power, that doesn't mean that Kurt would necessarily inherit those powers. And yeah, sure, but it would be really weird if he didn't. Kurt inherited pretty much everything else from Azazel, from his looks to his teleportation. And considering that other magical characters such as Clea Strange and Damon Hellstrom have inherited their power from their magical parent, it's not outside the realm of possibility for Kurt to have inherited his father's magical powers as well. Okay, so maybe he did inherit his father's magical power, but maybe it's just dormant. Unfortunately, I'm going to have to shut that option down as well. When Dr. Strange analyzed Kurt with the Eye of Agamotto in Uncanny X-Men Annual number 4, he noted that Kurt was peculiarly human, rather than the human-demon hybrid he initially expected Kurt to be, and we later learned that was correct. And if Kurt inherited his father's magical power, then that means that Kurt's magical power is missing. And when you really think about it, why else would Margali adopt Kurt? He's not her kid, and it's not like she's made any habit of adopting random orphans. About the only thing that comes close is her interactions with a young Scarlet Witch back during the comic Mystic Arcana Scarlet Witch. Additionally, Kurt is the son of a magically powerful demonic warlord who's already proven that he's magically powerful enough to teach Margali in the mystical arts. And Margali also has a long-standing motivation of trying to obtain more magical power for herself, and has proven that she is not above using even her own children to accomplish that end. But for the sake of argument, fine, let's give Margali the benefit of the doubt. What if Margali is just trying to use Kurt as leverage to obtain magical power from his father, Azazel? Well, that doesn't really work either, because Azazel doesn't really care about his kids. He was literally willing to sacrifice hundreds of them, including Kurt, just to open a portal between Earth and the Brimstone dimensions. And yes, Azazel did claim that he eventually came to care about Kurt, but even if he's telling the truth, by his own admission, he did not originally care about him. Which is all interesting to consider, given that Azazel was the one who rescued Kurt from Mystique, having thrown him off of the cliff shortly after giving birth to him. Now, why would Azazel do this? Am I just wrong about Azazel, and does he actually care about Kurt? Well, probably not, knowing Azazel. More than likely, there was something else going on here. Maybe he was doing a favor for Mystique, or maybe there was something really special about baby Kurt. And actually, how was Azazel able to save Kurt? It was established back during the Draco arc that Azazel was usually trapped in the Brimstone dimension and could only visit Earth during specific times, and even then, it wasn't for very long. And the probability of Kurt's birth lining up with one of these times seems a little too unlikely. Azazel probably would have needed someone to let him through to Earth to save Kurt. And considering that Margali had previously known Azazel and ended up with Kurt in the end, it's really not that big of a jump to realize that Margali was the one who probably let Azazel through. The only question is whether Azazel asked Margali to raise Kurt for him, or whether Margali demanded Kurt as payment for helping Azazel. Now at this point, some of you guys may be asking the question, 3 months. Wasn't the Winding Way around long before Nightcrawler was even born? And the answer is yes. There have been characters before who have referred to the Winding Way existing long before Nightcrawler was canonically born. Now, there are 2 possible explanations for all this happening. One possibility is that because Nightcrawler is able to teleport, he might be able to teleport through time as well as space, or at least he normally would be able to, but because his powers have been dampened at this point, he isn't able to do that anymore. technically this would allow him to access the past and allow people from the past to access the Winding Way, and grant them magical power. A bit fantastical, but I think the second option is probably what's going on here. Basically, the idea is that Nightcrawler is not the first source of the Winding Way, only the most recent. In this iteration, the Winding Way is less of a specific thing to Nightcrawler and more of a ritual that has happened to other magical creatures in the past. And the reason why it's Nightcrawler now is because all of those other sources have already burnt out. So did Margali do this? Well, she definitely had the motivation to do it, given that her motivation is to obtain magical power for herself no matter the cost. And as already mentioned, she certainly has no scruples about endangering the lives of innocent people, even her own children, to accomplish that goal. And Kurt isn't even her own child. What's more, she had ample opportunity to pull this off. After all, she was the one who raised Kurt practically from birth until he left the circus. Okay, so what about method? Well, in Uncanny X-Men Annual number 4, Kurt received a statue of himself which ended up magically stealing his soul. It turned out in that comic that Amanda Sefton was the one who originally sent that statue. And given that Amanda was trained in magic by her mother, Margali, then it stands to reason that Margali could do this too. And this suddenly explains how the Soul Sword would be able to influence the Winding Way. If what was taken from Kurt was part of his soul, then it would operate on a similar form of magic to the Soul Sword. And in that case, then it would also explain why Amanda needed to fuse the Soul Sword with Nightcrawler, because the Soul Sword can be used to break other spells, and could potentially be used to undo what Margali had done to him. But it's also designed to kill demons. And if the part of Kurt's soul that was taken from him was demonic in nature, then Amanda wouldn't exactly be able to use it directly to undo the magic. She must have figured out that by fusing the Soul Sword with Kurt's non-demonic half, she would be able to bypass the more dangerous aspects of the Soul Sword and use it as a bridge between his demonic and mutant halves to restore him to being whole again.
And with all this talk about Amanda, it really raises the question, how long has she been trying to accomplish all this? How long has she been trying to put the two parts of Kurt back together again? And personally, I would argue,
ever since she was first introduced. Because here's the thing, guys. It was Amanda who followed Kurt back from Germany and began to date him under the false identity of Amanda Sefton, and didn't even tell Kurt who she was until long after they had started dating. This is obviously suspicious. Likely the only person who would have known or cared who Szardos was in the whole of New York City or state would have been Nightcrawler. The circus that they hail from is from the backwoods of Germany, and the only American who was ever shown to have any sort of interest in it was from Florida, and even then he was only interested in Nightcrawler. The sheer idea that Jemaine would have changed her name for any other reason, other than to trick Kurt, is kind of laughable at this point. So then why? What was Amanda trying to accomplish with it? And all of this brings up the really awkward question of whether Amanda made Kurt fall in love with her. Because, again, the false identity. Why does she need to come up with a false identity just to get together with Kurt? If they were actually childhood sweethearts, you'd think that Jemaine would just be able to walk up to Kurt and say, hey, let's hook up again. But the fact that she has to go out of her way to make a false identity to just get back together with Kurt, supposedly, is kind of suspicious. Additionally, she may have had a motivation for trying to, hook up with Kurt, because as a member of the Winding Way, she would have had access to his demonic soul. So dating him may have been just a convenient way to get access to his mutant half so that she could figure out how to put those two parts back together again. And this is something that Kurt also brings up himself after having an encounter with the Beyonder. As he correctly points out, Amanda would have had the means and opportunity to pull this off. And with the combination of this theory, she would have had the motivation too. But there might be another reason why Amanda would follow Kurt back from Germany and decided to start dating him. And that answer would be she was trying to figure out, what the truth behind her brother's death. Now, so far in this video, I have yet to go over what exactly was going on with Margali's eldest child, Stefan Szardos. There's a reason for this. We don't know that much about him. Outside of being Kurt and Amanda's older brother, who he seemed to be on pretty good terms with, all that we know for sure about Stefan was that he was accidentally killed by Nightcrawler after he went crazy and started murdering children. Why did Stefan go crazy? Well, in Nightcrawler the Winding Way, it was revealed that Stefan had been summoning demons for some reason and ended up getting his soul devoured by one of them. Why was Stefan summoning demons? That's a really good question. The closest thing that the comics have ever given us to an answer is that he feared the dark side of his soul, quote unquote, whatever that means. However, one of the stranger aspects of Kurt's death is that he made Kurt swear to kill him if he ever took an innocent life. Which begs the question, how exactly would he have known that this was even a possibility of happening? Stefan has never been established to being a precog, so was he planning on summoning demons and knew that this might have gone wrong and just made a pact with Kurt in case if things did go wrong? Maybe, but it's hard to say. Without further details on the situation, there's no way of knowing for sure. Whatever it was that Stefan was up to, Amanda was trying to keep it hidden from Margali. This is perhaps best seen in Uncanny X-Men Annual number 4, when Amanda sent that magic statue to steal Kurt's soul. You see, following this, Professor X called in Dr. Strange, and both he and the rest of the X-Men were dragged off into a hellscape made by Margali Szardos, where they proceeded to go through a Dante Inferno-style journey trying to prove Kurt's innocence in the eyes of Margali. An interesting note about this whole situation is that Margali didn't know why Kurt had killed Stefan and simply assumed that it was in his character to do so, which is a weird thing to assume for someone who raised Kurt from birth, especially seeing as it's Kurt. More importantly, all the information that Margali gained about Stefan's death was gained through Kurt, who lacked the essential knowledge of why Stefan went crazy. This is a major piece of information that Margali is lacking that contributed hugely to her son's death, and seeing as it was Amanda who sent the statue of Kurt himself, we can extrapolate this was all Amanda's intention from the start. She even refers to the whole situation as a gamble for some reason. So what does this all have to do with what's going on right now in comics? Well, Legion of X just wrapped up, and a pretty big side plot in it was dealing with Nightcrawler suddenly growing horns and a magic spell that was turning various mutants into monsters. Now, it was revealed that Margali, working alongside Orcus, was the one who was behind all of this, that she did this to draw Kurt out so that she could take the Hope Sword from him. Additionally, there have been spoilers leaked from Sins of Sinister of a heavily mutated Nightcrawler being in chains and at the mercy of some sort of cosmic cult trying to steal magic artifacts from across the Marvel Universe. In lieu of all of this, the situation with Margali is supposed to be wrapped up in Sons of X, which is coming out in May. But hang on a minute. Hope Sword? What on earth is that? We haven't talked about that in the video so far. Well, as I said at an earlier point in this video, Margali confirmed that when the Soul Sword was removed from Kurt, it quote-unquote left gaps, to use Margali's own words. Gaps which Kurt apparently filled with hope? Humanity? Whatever it was. Apparently, it worked like a blacksmith's mold and was able to form a sword. Margali was able to extract the sword and has now run off, assumedly to kill more members of the Winding Way like what she did with the Soul Sword. And with that, I think I'll go ahead and transition from what we know to what I speculate will be. And don't get your hopes up, they're really not all that hard to guess. So my first prediction is I think Amanda will be successful in restoring Kurt using the Soul Sword. However, considering Excalibur, it's likely that both Amanda and Margali will probably have to die in order for this to happen. Mind, Amanda is already technically dead, so this may result in her soul being destroyed and her perma-dying. Definitely parallels Stefan if it turns out that he was trying to find a way to save Kurt the whole time like Amanda was. However, no matter what the consequences are, I'd imagine that Amanda would be fine with it. Her goal this whole time has been trying to restore Kurt, so as long as that happens, I think she'd be okay with the consequences. My second prediction is that Margali is not going to stop being a problem anytime soon. Even if she dies, she's likely going to try and find some way back from the dead and to get revenge on Kurt for everything that happened. Even going so far as to make deals with entities like Mephisto or Mother Righteous to be able to accomplish this. Likely, she would also blame Kurt for everything that happened and become a recurring antagonist trying to get her own self-perceived revenge against him, as well as trying to get her old powers back. Another easy prediction is that Kurt is going to be devastated. I know, such astute observation skills on display here. But seriously, Kurt's going to have a lot to unpack with this. Ultimately, though, I can see Kurt doubling down on being heroic and focusing on trying to make sure that the same thing that happened to him doesn't happen to anyone else, and will continue being generally heroic, albeit perhaps a little less jovial, and with a bit more angst. Perhaps another easy prediction is that Nightcrawler is likely going to take on a more magical role in the comics, both with the X-Men and without. Given that Margali was able to challenge Doctor Strange at the height of his power, we're not talking about an insignificant amount of magical power that Nightcrawler has access to. And besides this, the Quiet Council has been looking for someone with expertise in magical knowledge to sit on it. Additionally, due to the fact that his demonic conscience has spent the last several decades fighting against various members of the Winding Way for control, he's likely accrued an immense amount of magical knowledge during that time. For Nightcrawler, though, he probably won't appreciate all of this given how much of a sore spot it is for him. My final prediction is that the relationship between Nightcrawler and magic is going to become a lot more complicated. Due to no choice of their own, both of them now find themselves bonded through the Soul Sword, which leaves a whole lot of questions for different writers to answer. Are Nightcrawler and magic connected due to their souls being bonded, similar to the psychic link between Cyclops and Jean Grey? How does that affect them individually as well as their relationship to each other? Do they reject it, or do they try to make do with the situation? Does one of them accept it while the other tries to find a way to undo it? Additionally, Nightcrawler and magic are going to have a lot of uncomfortable parallels in terms of their childhood experiences and trauma. How will they react to that? Would the trauma push them away from each other, or would it cause them to open up and try to come to terms with said trauma? All of this doesn't even account for the fact that Illyana may already have romantic feelings for Kurt, as first revealed during the Empire X-Men tie-in, when Illyana got drunk on magical power and, among other things, began hitting on Nightcrawler. Now, this may just be the magic talking, but people do tend to be a bit more honest when drunk, so she may have been genuine. However, things might also get complicated between magic and Nightcrawler because Nightcrawler may become Belasco. This was a major turning point in the alternate universe Earth X, where Nightcrawler was turned into Belasco at the manipulations of Mephisto, who had taken offense to Nightcrawler being a hero despite his appearance. Now, this is more of a possibility than a prediction on my part, given that Earth X is an alternate universe that has seemingly been forgotten by the mainstream audience, and I sincerely doubt that Marvel will make a 616 Nightcrawler into Belasco. That said, I can see them saying that Belasco is an alternate version of Nightcrawler that has shown up due to the timey-wimey nature of Limbo. I could see them using Belasco as a sort of worst-case scenario of what Nightcrawler could become, especially if he gives in to manipulations of characters like Mephisto. Speaking of Mephisto, he does seem to have an odd fascination with Nightcrawler. Back when Nightcrawler first came into possession of the Soul Sword, he tried to make a deal with Kurt to keep the Soul Sword out of an upcoming war between the different Hell Lords, something which Kurt refused to do. Additionally, Mephisto showed up at the end of Nightcrawler's solo adventure following the X-Men's breakup in Manifest Destiny. During that story, Nightcrawler went back to Bavaria, where he encountered a boy named Vielfrass who had been cursed into looking like a demon by a local witch after trying to hook up with the witch's granddaughter. Now, the story ended up with Vielfrass dying and Mephisto showing up to collect his soul, during which he told Kurt that it always ends like this. Now, the similarities between Nightcrawler and Vielfrass's situations are quite glaring in the story and obviously made to mirror each other. However, when put into the context of my theory of Nightcrawler being the Winding Way, this feels in retrospect like Mephisto is all but telling Kurt the truth about Margali. With him saying it always ends like this, it suggests that Mephisto may have seen something of this sort play out before, specifically with Kurt. Then again, Mephisto is also a pretty notorious liar, and he was trying to mess with Kurt in that story. Still, Mephisto is probably one of the few characters I would feel comfortable in saying that if anyone was likely to know what really happened between Kurt and Margali, it would be him. And Mephisto may not be the only one who knew. Doctor Strange may know as well. You see, back in 1982, a few months after Margali had first been introduced, she had a scuffle with Doctor Strange after he refused to take her daughter in as an apprentice. The fight culminated with Doctor Strange isolating Margali from her power source, the Wand of Power, which he then confiscated from her. Assumedly, Doctor Strange still has this artifact locked up in the Sanctum Sanctorum, and would only take one look using the Eye of Agamotto to see the truth of Nightcrawler's situation. That said, if Doctor Strange knew the truth about what had happened to Kurt, then why hasn't he done anything about it? Maybe he couldn't, maybe he wouldn't, but the far more likely option here is that he simply doesn't know. However, there may be a couple of other characters who I can say with far more certainty knew the truth about Kurt's situation. When Kurt first met Mystique back in Uncanny X-Men number 142, he asked her who she was, to which Mystique essentially replied with, "Ask Margali, who would know better than her?" This obviously raises the question, assuming that Mystique is telling the truth, of when these two have ever met, because there's not a single instance in the comics where Mystique and Margali have ever been shown on panel together. Now, maybe Mystique is lying, but it would be kind of a weird thing to lie about, especially at the time that she made the statement. Why would she go out of her way to bring up Margali Szardos with Nightcrawler in the middle of a fight with him? But perhaps the more glaring part of this is something that happens in a flashback during Excalibur -1. Margali reveals the Soul Sword to Amanda Sefton and accurately predicts that the Soul Sword would pass into Amanda's possession at some point in the future. Mind, this was years before the Soul Sword ever came into existence, so how exactly Margali was able to predict it would come to pass is extremely suspicious, especially seeing as she's never been established to be a precog. That is unless Margali wasn't the one doing the predicting, but rather Destiny was. See, what I think may have happened was that when Mystique finally met back up with Destiny again after having Kurt, she told Destiny what happened, and using her powers, Destiny realized what Margali was going to do to Kurt, and both resolved to stop her. However, considering Margali's considerable magical power, it's highly unlikely that Destiny would have thought they'd be able to take Margali in a fight. Thus, she and Mystique confronted Margali, and playing on her thirst for power, told her about a magical sword that would come to pass to her and then her daughter. Knowing that Margali wouldn't be able to pass up the opportunity to obtain a powerful magical artifact, and thus would kickstart Amanda's quest to fuse the Soul Sword with Nightcrawler and undo her mother's work, Destiny and Mystique left Kurt behind. Alternatively, it may have been that they allowed this to happen to Kurt, as Destiny saw some convenient outcome for the both of them. Though what exactly that would be is hard to say. And with all that said, I think I've pretty much said everything I want to say about this theory on Nightcrawler being the Winding Way. Again, I might be wrong about all of this, but considering what has been established with the characters as well as the sheer amount of evidence that I've been able to scrounge up for this video, I wouldn't be surprised if it turned out that more than half of what I said was true. But what do you guys think about all this? Put your thoughts and theories in the comments down below. Thank you all for watching this, and until next time, this is 3 Months Too Late, signing off.